Alert. Hive City Primus. Status. Lost. Compliance. Not achievable. Enemy forces. Overwhelming.
When I first got the Black Templar army set, as well as the Start Collecting box set, I didn't realize that I actually had 2 of these models. So naturally, I want to Kitbash him into something else. I started off by trying to rip his arms off, but it clearly wasn't working as I did a great job gluing the model together. So instead, I opted into my trusty red pliers. When assembling my models, I always use a very large amount of Tamiya thin cement. As a result, this model is essentially one solid piece of plastic. However, I still did my best to recover my favorite part, which is the backpack. I definitely want to use the cool power pack for a future Kitbash. I continued trying to rip off that shoulder and realized that it was actually connected to a massive piece of the cloak. So I considered not removing it entirely and instead putting a pauldron on top of it. But for now, I carefully put my pliers between the arm and essentially wedged it off. And luckily, it came off undamaged. Unfortunately, I knew that the head was glued in extremely well, so I was gonna have to rip it off. Next up, I began trying some different pieces to try to figure out what am I actually going to make this model into. I knew that I wanted this model to feel different from the Marshal, but at the same time to have just a slight resemblance to it. So the arm had to go, as I really wanted to provide a really unique pose for him. And the worst part was the fact that I did not realize just how much of that arm was connected to the cloak. Once I managed to get the arm off, I proceeded to clean that area, removing any of the leftover plastic that was sticking out, trying to scrape off the area clear and not damage the tabard. I also began cutting into the cloak as I realized no pauldron would actually fit there. So I had to start chunking parts away, then trying to clean some more of that shoulder from the cloak. Afterwards, I decided to remove a lot of the bling from this guy. As awesome as all this stuff looks, it does make him look nearly identical to the other model. And when I started removing these chains, it felt like it would be quite an easy task. However, I quickly realized that they were actually molded into the collar as well. So I took out the heavy flamer. And as I sat there surrounded by toxic fumes, I had an epiphany. Perhaps, and hear me out, this wasn't a good idea. So I got out some sandpaper and began cleaning up the area, trying to remove the pieces of the plastic that got melted a little bit more than I expected. And after I sanded for about 10 minutes, I began scraping off some of the collar pieces that got melted, ironically, in the exact way I actually wanted them to be. Afterwards, grabbing some Tamiya thin cement and doing now a chemical melt, smoothing out the plastic areas just to match the rest of the model. Then I grabbed my box of extra bits and started to figure out what exactly is this model gonna be. I considered going the classic route of giving it maybe a chain sword, a power sword, or maybe even a really cool relic. Alas, in the moment, none of those ideas were quite resonating with me. So I kept trying even more arms, putting him in different scenarios that I felt like would match the model really well. And then I went back to the piece that I first got out, the very basic classical bolter. And something about that specific weapon spoke to me in the moment, as the dynamic nature of the pose felt really perfect and really awesome. So I ended my search and decided to glue his arms together, giving him very basic Intercessor shoulder pads. And then I thought turning this guy into a Castellan would actually be a really cool idea. Since I have both models, I can say that this guy is actually the exact same character as the Marshal. However, many years before his promotion. As a result, he looks incredibly simple, however distinct enough. Not to mention, I just really like that bolter with those specific attachments. And since I was turning him into an earlier version of the Castellan, I gave him an incredibly simple, basic backpack from an Intercessor I had. And this guy was looking absolutely fantastic. All I had to do was just scrape the cloak a little bit more. Then I got out a few tiny sprues for my Chaos Space Marine. I've been meaning to try some of these Aegis Sigmar Chaos models for quite some time, and I thought their really retro look just looked really cool. Not to mention this really awesome flail from the mounted set. Next up, I made a few Chaos Space Marines trying to figure out whose pose am I gonna use. And while the first guy had a really cool chest plate, the problem was I did not have the correct arm to match the shield with. However, the third Chaos Space Marine I assembled had the perfect pose for it. After clipping his arm off, I dry fitted the shield just to see if I'd made the right cut. Luckily, no adjustments were needed, so all I had to do was just fill in a bit of sprue glue and attach the arm. For the head, my original intention was to go with a helmetless option, however, I really liked the retro feel of that helmet. And I felt something was missing, and it was the power pack. I guess that helmet was so fantasy, I forgot about the power pack. Unfortunately for the flail, no matter how many different areas and angles I tried, it just did not look right on this model. And I think it worked out for the better as the one-hander bolter and shield combination looked really cool. Using the lighter was not the brightest idea. However, learning some proper video editing with the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare, has been a really great one. Personally, I took a learning path about DaVinci Resolve, which is the editing software I use, that taught me some incredibly awesome things that some of them were incredibly simple, others were incredibly complex. It's actually how I created the introduction to today's video, using one of the learning paths as well as one additional class that specifically targeted that style that I was really hoping to achieve. It taught me how to take a 2D image and convert it into a 3D map, as well as add that really cool tracking dot that traverses across the screen. On Skillshare, you can learn a variety of different things, all the way from coding to something as simple as cooking an egg. Not to mention cool things like music, photography, UI design, and even film and video editing, which is the main thing I'm doing. Skillshare currently has a special offer where the first 500 people to join using my link will get an entire month for free, allowing you to try a variety of different classes, not to mention some really cool learning paths. So click on the link below, join Skillshare, and learn something really cool. And thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and a bigger thanks to you for watching. On the Black Templar, I decided to start with painting his tabard first, going in with British khaki and mixing in some warm gray into it. The reason I decided to paint the tabard first is that previously I would actually paint it nearly last. However, due to the fact that we're working with a near white color, anytime you miss, you have to do a lot of cleanup afterwards. And on the specific model, I definitely had to go really deep in some of the areas. For the texture of the cloth, I decided to go for this cross section that I thought looked kinda cool. Then simply working my way all the way to the white highlights. Following the exact same pattern I previously established on all of the cloth. I then grabbed a little bit of black and fixed all of the areas where I missed. When it came to the armor, I decided to try something a little bit different. I simply took a bit of the black paint I used previously and added a bit of white into it, which shockingly resulted in a surprisingly blue color. For the texture, I decided to go for something a little bit battle damaged, slowly adding a tiny bit of white into my paint and working up on the highlights. I went for a chaotic pattern to symbolize the fact that this armor is damaged, dirty, and has seen a lot of battle. I also did a tiny combination of edge highlights as I felt like it would really do favors to some of the areas. For the face, I took a little bit of Bugman Glow and mixed some black into it. Afterwards, I began highlighting the face with just pure Bugman Glow, adding a bit of pure white into it and establishing some of the highlighted areas. I took quite a bit of time on this, and I thought it was actually turning out kind of decent. So I kept working up to the higher whites. However, I felt like the model was looking a little bit too pale. So I tried using some Gilman Flesh and ruined the entire face. For some reason, I remember that paint being very nearly transparent, however, it came on very strong. I tried washing it off, however, the damage was done. So I waited for the paint to dry, and then came back in with Bugman's Glow. I then had an idea to try out this really faded hair effect, where I mixed in my previous skin tone and added a tiny amount of black into it, going over all of the areas where I thought that he would have hair, as well as giving him a 5 o'clock shadow look, which surprisingly turned out really cool, and I just really enjoyed that effect. It's definitely something I want to try a lot more in the future. Afterwards, I went back over all of the hair areas and tried doing something that I never usually do in my faces, give him some eyebrows, which again surprised me that it turned out kind of decent, so I gave him some white eyeballs. For the cloak, I simply used some burnt red and applied it in a very thin layer. After that was dry, I grabbed a bit of burnt red and began my highlights. Similar to the cloth of the tabard, I began doing a cross-checkered pattern, hopefully creating a bit of texture on the cloth and make it a bit more interesting, proceeding to work my way all the way into the pure red. I also decided to glaze a tiny amount of red as I felt like the cloak was looking a little bit too dark. Afterwards, I decided to work a little bit more on the armor, so I mixed in a bit more white to my previous color, doing more of the edge highlighting as well as following the chaotic pattern even more. This time, I did do some additional edge highlighting on all of the armor panels that I previously missed, as the model just wasn't popping as much as I really wanted to. For the shoulder pads, I decided to go for the very classic look of white shoulder pauldrons with a black trim, tediously working my way through a very dark gray all the way into the pure white. Additionally, giving him the proper red weapon that is usually seen in Black Templars. For the lantern, I simply applied some white paint onto it, remembered I forgot to highlight the bolter, and then airbrushed some Imperial Fist yellow to create a little bit of an OSL effect. Luckily, the tabard was white enough that I didn't have to deal with a green overglow. Then using a little bit of white paint to create the hot areas on the lantern. I then mixed in a bit of the previous color I was using through the airbrush and began applying the OSL highlight points that essentially help out the effect. Afterwards, grabbing some gunmetal gray and doing the chains on all of the weapons. From then out, I decided to do some manual shadowing on the shoulders. And after I finished and based the model, I just decided that I really needed to give it a wash, as unfortunately it was looking a little bit too gray and blue and not enough black. For the Chaos Space Marines, I had an idea for an army painting speed technique that I really want to try out and see if it actually looks pretty good. So I started off similar to the previous video, where just I dry brushed some gunmetal gray, which always gives a really cool effect. Afterwards, I grabbed some burn tin from AK and began applying it all over the trim. I tried to do this quite fast, so I missed in a lot of the areas. However, given the fact that it was a speed paint job, I was not concerned too much about that. I then mixed a little bit of chrome into the previous metal color and did all the edge highlights once again. For all the weapon and shield and eye parts, I first of all applied some white, then used some Tesseract blue through an airbrush. Both these models were actually painted at the same time, so afterwards when I got out the wash, I decided I might as well give this guy a wash as well. Honestly, I'm really glad the fact that I decided to come back and use the wash, as the miniatures just weren't having the depth I wanted behind them, and this kind of saved them for me, and I think they look absolutely incredible now. So with that, let's see the final result.